Thank you, Joyce, for this presentation. I have to say that I've used my original title, but it actually underrepresents half of my talk, because the second half actually deals with Picasso's first retrospective taking place in 1932, which is the topic of my latest article, which is currently under consideration. Important to say, an exhibition that Picasso himself curated. If anyone sees any of the many Picasso shows that are out there, no one has curated Picasso's work as Picasso himself, as you'll soon see. Let's admit it, in the field of art history, thinking about André Breton is so out of fashion, easily 40 years out of date. I mean, Bataille is more fashionable, but even he is kind of 90s. I'd say that Michel Aris or Carl Einstein, whose work was just examined by my friend and colleague George Chad, are more in right now. According to Walter Benjamin, who never seems to be falling out of fashion, lagging behind the fashion of the day provides an example of unique temporalities, which is created by conflating past and present. This multifaceted interplay of times forms a constellation, or in Benjamin's terms, a dialectical image. Breton's datedness within academic discourse seems quite suitable for the topic of today's talk, since this overlapping modality is precisely what typifies Breton's own writing on the history of Surrealist movement. In this respect, if being outmoded suggests deploying an awkward temporal position, I will gladly occupy this stance today. Michel Bourgeois famously argued in his From Text to Performance that the readers of Breton's first Surrealist manifesto arrived to the party too late. Bourgeois claims in this text, as well as that in this text, as well as Le Papeldoux or Aragon's Le Pesant de Paris, are nostalgic, since they report on the experimental phase of automatic writing, which by then was already history. So while the temporal horizon of many other modernist manifesto was based on a projection towards a yet-to-be materialized future, the first Surrealist manifesto describes that which has already happened. The call for practicing automatic writing techniques was merely an artificial repetition, performed and manufactured as a noun. My claim today that the belatedness of the first manifesto is symptomatic of Breton's essay on the history of Surrealism. The texts are written by multiple manners of being in time, multiple temporalities that simultaneously bring forth different forms and functions of time. My argument is twofold, as I mentioned. I will examine how this multiplice model is essential to the 1934 What is Surrealism? Then I will move to study how Breton evoked this mixed temporality to explicate Pablo Picasso's position within the Surrealist movement. This aspect of Bretonian Surrealism, I argue, reveals that a single definition of modernist temporality will simply not suffice. Breton's writing rejects the assumption that the two dominant narratives for describing vanguard history are mutually exclusive. Usually, history of avant-garde has been divided to either recounting a linear progression through negating, criticizing, or superseding that which preceded it, and of course, Berger or Adorno are clear examples, or articulating narratives of survival and persistence of form and influence, is seen, for example, in Hal Foster's analysis of the neo-avant-garde, or more recently in last year's Medieval Modern by Alex Nago. The importance of this conference, I believe, is in its sustained study of diverse temporal modality, a plurality that enables to go beyond the interpretation of history as either ruptured or continuous. That is to say, the representation of time is either streamlined or jagged. Breton's heterogeneous, multiplicitous, and accentrous representation of time as unfolding in history will be one such example. With no more delays, let's start. In 1934, in a lecture taking place, how appropriately, 20 minutes from here, in Brussels, Breton looked back at the history of the Surrealist movement. The text is a didactic one, designed to continue the spread of Surrealism in Belgium and to pay homage to its local practitioners. Like so many of Breton's essays, it is informed by the politics of the movement. One can read the text through the changing alliances, the arrival of new favorites, and rejection of old ones. but instead I wish to examine the text as a model for surrealist history making. What is surrealism is both retrospective and selective in its approach. Breton self-consciously addresses his position as historian in the text. He is, quote, looking back at the past, and speaks of the need to, quote, do justice when describing the reception of Le Tremont, and mentioned that many others have already written the history of surrealism. While being cognizant of the text at hand, Breton does not provide a linear account of surrealism history, but utilizes textual and structural devices which embrace contradictions, repetition, and lapse in logic as his mode of operation. The most staggering, quote-unquote, confusion is in the fact that Breton posits several dates as possible starting points for the birth of the movement. At one moment, he suggests that surrealism began in 1919 with the intuitive period, that's his term, when several writers begin practicing different automatic strategies. At another paragraph, it is 1920, when surrealism broke from Dada, which is presented as the moment of origin. Elsewhere in the publication, it is the publication of the first manifesto in 1924. Intriguingly, and most crucial to my argument today, 1870 is also proposed as the starting point, as Breton places the period's literary production, more specifically the great poet Maudit, in direct connection with the surrealist effort. He explains that while some argue that the surrealist affinity with the past results from, and I quote, youthful exaltation and the general savagery of the time, end quote, but at the same breath, he states that without this account, without this attitude, and I quote, one cannot form an idea of what surrealism really stands for. This attitude alone can account for all the excesses that may be attributed to us, but which cannot be deplored unless one supposes that we could have started from any other point, end quote. These excesses also typified another aspect of surrealist movement, namely the definition of surrealism as both an historical movement and a state of mind, or sensitivity, which is ahistorical in its essence. Surrealism is both a contemporary artistic phenomenon, that is to say linked to a present that is unfolding, and an ahistorical entity, which is eternal and unchanging. These two qualities allow it to be practiced both by contemporary living writers and artists who consciously adopt surrealist technique, as well as found in the work of Le Tremont, Rimbaud, Shakespeare, or Dante, who are obviously not official members of the movement. One can be surrealist by adhering to the movement's goal, participating in exhibition publication, signing manifesto, but also, according to Breton, one can become surrealist by demonstrating some elusive qualities, such as surrealist in dialectic, surrealist in sadism, in morals, in life and elsewhere, and so on. This shift between what is usually perceived as opposing expressions of time also dictates another lapse in Breton's historical logic, the presentation of secession as simultaneously forward and backward looking. First, progressive linearity. Breton defined the two distinctive periods in the history of the surrealist movement. He calls the first period, and I quote, the purely intuitive epoch of surrealism, which lasted between 1919 and 1925, and the second taking place from 1925 to 1934, and is defined as the reasoning period. Breton explains that the two periods oppose each other, and I quote, the first can summarily be characterized by the belief expressed during this time in the all-powerfulness of thought, considered capable of freeing itself by means of its own resources, end quote. He then explains that he no longer holds this view and qualifies the first period as, quote, extremely mistaken, end quote. This approach to history, through periodization, is one of the tenets of traditional modernist temporality, which imagine history through an agonistic rhythm, where one movement replaces that which preceded it. According to this view, once the intuitive period was over, it was replaced by the reasoning period, suggesting that knowledge and political awareness replaced instinct and experimentation. However, at the same time, that Breton evokes a progressive model of historicity, it is produced as forked. While avant-garde in its defining moment created histories of rupture and tradition, or as histories of survival and persistence, Breton practiced linear history at times as a break and at other times as continuation. These inconsistencies enable this multi-temporality. He is both heralding a new stage that overcomes that which preceded it, and at the same time nostalgically calling for a return to past moments, as well as sees a clear line between Surrealist practice and past art, text, and attitude. The return is most acutely felt when Breton revisits the idea of the first period, by integrating into the fabric of what is Surrealism long quotes from the text written during this allegedly obsolete intuitive period. One of the examples is behind us. Thus undermining the linear narrative he just traced. Breton cites pages and pages from the Surrealist Manifesto, the first one, as well as Aragon on Vague de Rêve from 1924 and section from Surrealist in Painting from 1928. The quotation, textual materiality is intriguing. By citing these 1920s texts, they function both as remnants of another period, functioning as a kind of verbal spolia, who is noticeably foreign in tone, language, and rhetoric to the new context, as well as reviving guidelines for practicing Surrealism through passive textual operation, which, as already stated, were already out of date in 1924. These paragraphs gain force from the quotation since they are being revalidated, but also they are altered. As you can see here, the Y and N suggest whether they were actually a part of the original manifesto. But also they are altered by the new context and the selected quotation. Mostly, Breton does not use the text as is, so to speak, but updates them to fit recent idea regarding Surrealism. For example, when quoting from the first manifesto, he alters, omits, and adds name to the list of Surrealist predecessors, constantly redoing and undoing history. What is Surrealism articulates then a linear narrative only to unravel it by producing multiple versions, offering contradicting moments of inception, conflating past and present, and quoting canonical texts while challenging them. This consistently inconsistent approach is quintessential Surrealist as it offers a narrative which goes in simultaneous and asynchronous direction. This tendency is not limited to the history of Surrealism alone. I will now utilize this model to comprehend Breton's approach to Pablo Picasso's art and the Surrealist relationship, and the artist's relationship to Surrealism. I will focus on Breton's reaction to Picasso's 1932 retrospective, an exhibition Picasso himself curated, and analyze the exhibition display in light of this model for historical thinking I've just proposed. Art historians are conflicted about Picasso's relationship with the Surrealist movement. While Anne Baldassari, among others, shows the pervasiveness of Surrealist motif in Picasso's art, others, like Picasso's biographer John Richardson, claim that Picasso never adhered to the movement line. Putting aside the slippery terrain of the artist's intention, Picasso has a unique status in Breton's writing, who, as convincingly argued by Elizabeth Cowling, attempted to woo Picasso to join the movement. The first Surrealist manifesto described the painter as both precedent to the Surrealist movement, à la Notre Amon, and an active member of the group. And you can see Picasso is also a part of this calling of past Surrealist artists. Picasso being one of the only figures in Breton's mythology to embody the temporal complexity that defines Surrealism. Picasso's pre-war painting and collages were reproduced in the movement's journal, and in Breton's Surrealism and painting, pre-war Cubism transformed into post-war Surrealism since, and I quote Neil Cox in a recent publication, Breton finds the kind of vigorous resistance to naive confidence in modern art that Surrealism was designed to promote, end quote. In 1907, another example, Demoiselle d'Avignon, held a special status in Breton's thought, imagining the piece as both forward and backward looking. It is a key example of Cubism painting and vision as Surrealist, and it relates to a distant past when Breton claimed, in a letter to Jacques Duché, that the painting possesses ritualic qualities that typifies medieval art. And I quote, "This is the painting that we would be carrying through the streets of our capital, as was Cimabue's version in times past," end quote. In the 1933 Picasso in His Elements, Breton describes the painter as the quintessential surrealist artist, whose art expresses, and I quote, the continuously dialectic process of Picasso's thought, especially the artist in light of Breton's latest definition of surrealism as one that is the reconciliation of opposites. This trait, he argues, is also apparent in the installation of Picasso's first retrospective show. During the exhibition last June in Galerie Georges Petit, Picasso placed on opposite sides of a long room two great ironworks, one of which seemed covered in rust and the other freshly coated with white paint, showing quite clearly that with their extremely dissimilar coverings, he wanted the two to answer each other as visitors passed by. These two statues, twins beyond any doubt, exchange all the remarks of a likely ironic philosophy, remarks that become apt the moment when oneself raised the problem of faith. Breton reveals, and this is actually quite crucial, in my research on the exhibition, basically we have something like 35 images of this retrospective, but we don't have any floor plan that would allow us to actually create a coherent floor plan and exhibition design. One of the things that Breton does is tell us that these two identical sculptures were actually positioned in the same space, facing one another. So what we see here is the two version of Woman in a Garden, which, according to Breton, now we know face one another in the same room. The two objects were listed separately in the exhibition catalog. This is the last page of the exhibition catalog, appearing under the generic title sculpture, number 229 and 230. Only their identical size indicates that they are connected. They are further distinguished by their materials and their execution. The first, number 229, made in 1930 from painted iron, whereas the bronze piece, number 230, took 3 years to create. The catalog's listing highlights chronological and material narratives, designating the earlier piece as the original and the later as a version, that is to say, a copy. This timeline plays into those accounts which perceives Picasso's ironwork as groundbreaking. Art historian argued that Picasso's collaboration with Julio González experimented with new materials and novel technique, and introduced novel technique into sculptural production. The bronze copy of the welded iron piece, like the second Woman in the Garden, the dark one, problematized this story. Rosalind Krauss, for example, heavily criticized Picasso for choosing to copy the iron piece in bronze, claiming that by doing so, the artist, and I quote Krauss, validated the conceptual uniqueness of the original, end quote. Werner Spies and Peter Reed each argue that the more durable bronze was chosen because of technical constraints, claiming that since the sculpture was intended to be placed outdoors as a part of the monument to Apollinaire, iron would simply not do. We can talk more during the Q&A if you're interested about the different material properties of these two sculptures, as well as the process of remaking the copy. These two interpretations posit the bronze copy as regressive, merely a compromise which negates the achievement of the iron sculpture. By juxtaposing the two sculptures in the same space, Picasso ignores these hierarchies. Moreover, since information was nowhere to be found in the galleries themselves, the exhibition information label only included the catalog number. Usually they appear, I don't know if you can see, but this small white square, for example, is simply a reference to the number of the painting in the catalog. So whereas today we're used to going to a museum and receiving fuller information, this was not the case in the 1930s. So these histories were not immediately available to viewers of the show. Instead, viewers like Breton perceived the two works as, and I quote again, twins beyond any doubt. Some might disregard Breton's description as merely an error in identification, a mistake, no doubt, encouraged by Picasso's display, but mistake nonetheless. But this misunderstanding enables a reading of the display in light of the multitemporality model described earlier, which undermine both linear narrative of progress as well as a unidirectional representation of time. First, the sculpture's varying surfaces, noted by Breton, ironically reverses the linear narrative described above in the catalogue. Since the earlier iron-welded piece was actually the newer-looking one, as it was covered in a fresh coat of white paint, and the later bronze sculpture appeared time-worn due to the exudation process, the object's appearance reverses the chronological relationship as outlined in the catalogue. The sculptures also play with the assumption of how time affects material, deliberately impeding viewers to guess the work's age, that is to say, which one came first, just by mere appearance. Second, the display connects the sculptures through their formal similarity, but highlights their material changing qualities through time. These different modalities work to strengthen the connection between the objects, and their differences also function as some sort of memento mori. What I am now, you will soon be. In their dissimilarities, the two sculptures introduce real time into the exhibition, not as an analytic parameter, which informs progressive accounts of history, but as tangible entity, which impacts all things. Breton does not consider the time of the artwork itself, the inherent anachronism of all artworks, according to Georges Gilberlin, and instead mobilize the duration of viewing, that is to say, the time it takes to walk from one piece to the other, to concretize temporality and bring forth what he perceives as the problem of destiny, the inevitability of aging. Breton's description stressed the multiple temporality the installation advanced, the chronological progressive narrative that was available to viewer who saw the show with the catalogue at hand, while the work's appearance undermined this timeline, since the older piece actually looked newer. Another dimension is added when the two sculptures were installed in space and their similarities was underscored. And finally, they perceived them in light of an inevitable future, a progression toward immediate destiny based on material properties, as well as the viewer's inevitable fate. This multitemporality can be further expanded. The painting, surrounding the two sculptures can also be read through their presentation of temporal modality. Even though their installation is incomplete, you can see a bunch of paintings actually still on the floor, we can see that the 19 pieces largely belong to a limited time period in Picasso's career. Works usually understood in relationship to the Cubist project and ranging from 1906 to 1915, and are connected in their vertical format, subject matter, composition, color palette, and tendency toward geometrization. These works, however, differ in their degree of abstraction. Examine, for example, the relationship between the three paintings surrounding the bronze woman in a garden. The Hang links the more crude depiction of the sexually ambiguous figure in the 1907 nude with raised arm, which I replicated these at the top of the pyramid, and the more abstract and refined renditions of the later woman with pears to the right and woman in an armchair to the left of the sculptures, both later pieces from the summer of 1909. The formal changes, without the guidance of the catalogue, could be read as following one of two opposing sequences, either advancing chronologically, as the catalogue and linear art history would have it, from the cruder African-inspired works to the more refined Hota painting, or alternatively, moving in the opposite direction, from the refined Hota works to crude, in a sequence that defied evolutionary schemes, à la Françoise. These two simultaneous storylines thrives on the heterogeneity and multidirectional that contradictory thinking brings forth. They are joined by other possibilities, such as positioning the sculpture head of a woman, right here on the pedestal, as an entry or endpoint to this narrative, and the alternative dimension each reading suggests. The Hang does not produce a single dominant reading, nor does it follow a one-dimensional and synchronic modality. The work's display form an ever-changing map of crossing routes, delineating possible histories where formal influences appear to trickle up or down, move sideways or diagonally, or hop without any apparent pattern through space. The multitemporality advanced by Picasso's exhibition curation is connected to the model of historical thought Breton developed in the text quoted before. Both occasions practice retrospective thought, one through writing, the other through arranging painting and sculpture in space, without duplicating the common narrative structure usually available to such instances, by employing linear progression, unidirectional evolution, or consistent periodization. Both Breton's What is Surrealism and Picasso's exhibition Hang could be described as expressing, quote-unquote, poor understanding of historical account. The artist himself said, by the way, that his exhibition was badly arranged. But in their inconsistencies, they open a possibility for employing a temporal position, which is heterogeneous, multiplicitous, and acentered. Thank you.